The gospel is always political, especially Luke's gospel. He's arguably one of the more socialist of all the writers out of Matthew, Mark, and John. But his interest is always writing from a political perspective. And before you prepare to call the CRA, indicating I'm violating anything, I'm not telling you who to vote for. I'm not even going to talk about any political party. All I'm merely saying today is that perhaps it's a move of God that Palm Sunday and Holy Week comes as we enter into Election Day, as we enter into this federal cycle. The story finds us, once again, with Jesus going to get into a little trouble, as he normally has been in the last several chapters, with the religious authorities. They're not happy, once again. They're not happy with the crowds. They're not happy with this trouble that seems to be stirring up. They're not happy about these prophecies that Jesus is seemingly fulfilling. And the reason the Pharisees speak out is because they have to answer to someone. Not just to God, but perhaps more frighteningly, the Roman garrison in Rome. So while they may agree a bit with what Jesus is saying, there is still a very real concern there for what might happen if this parade goes from a cute Williamstown Santa Claus parade to something like the Santa Claus parade in Disney, for example. One, the Romans could tolerate, but if Jesus had anything akin to any of the parades you see in the States, such as the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, Jerusalem would truly suffer. So perhaps we can understand why the Pharisees weren't overly thrilled about what might happen should the Romans hear about this procession. What's interesting about this procession, as I've said, as we have palm branches, this is very meek and mild. There's not any loud shouting of hosannas. There are some cloaks on the path, sure. In this reading, there is a colt and not a donkey. There seems to be a lot less fanfare. For anyone who's participated in a parade, DJ who has pulled the float, some tasks are harder than others. And I know Sandra is looking for people to hand out candy next year at the Santa Claus parade. So if you're thinking ahead, please speak to Sandra following the service. But lots happens in a parade. Lots can happen. There's people shouting. There's kids clamoring for candy. There's bigger kids edging out their younger siblings to get the better candies, as if there are better candies in a parade. There's shouting, there's clapping, there's singing, there's silence. There's children being lifted up on shoulders. It's a joyous occasion. But there's something that happens in the Gospel according to Luke, as joyful as it may seem, and perhaps this is us as modern readers looking into it, we unfortunately know how this story ends. Each year we are reminded how this story ends and how it begins again. So perhaps it's lost a bit of its surprise to us. And that is why we must lean into the political understandings of what this parade is doing. Historically, in ancient cities around the world, a king's entrance or a ruler's entrance into a city, they don't enter in to claim kingship. They're not entering in to be made king. Rather, Jesus' entry and procession into Jerusalem presupposes an already achieved victory. It is an already achieved victory because of the miracles that we have heard about through the gospel according to Luke. It is a victory because of all the good news that he has brought to the poor, to the marginalized, and those on the outsides. So when he's processing into Jerusalem, he does not need to have town criers reminding the people about all the good works that he has done. He does not need to have people carrying lots of gifts and treasures into the city. He does not need to be processing in on steeds or on camels. He does not need an entourage around him, reminding people that he is king, reminding them to keep the peace. But Jesus processes into Jerusalem in this way, according to the gospel, according to Luke, because the victory has already been won. That in Jesus' mind and the minds of all those he preached to and brought good news to, Jesus is king. Jesus has brought the good news, and victory has been achieved. There's no need for a military entourage or a show. There's no need for a display of power, because Jesus' power has already been displayed for the last 18 chapters in the gospel according to Luke. But interestingly enough, for the first time in the gospel according to Luke, Jesus acknowledges and accepts what the crowd has said as they declare him king, as they declare him Messiah. The first time in the gospel according to Luke, he has done this. And he does this not with a grand speech. He does not do so with fireworks or a trumpet. But he does so simply and silently nodding his head, plodding away on a colt. He acknowledges the cries and the shouts of acclamation of all the folks that came to see him. And for the first time, by not rebuking what they claim him to be, he accepts them. And they lovingly celebrate and welcome him into the city, not as a conquering hero, not as a conquering king, but as a king, as a prophet, as a son of God who has already won. Jesus, in his ministries according to Luke, has spoken of liberation theology. In his context, he has spoken about the issues of oppression and discrimination, taking advantage of tax collectors, people being ostracized because of physical infirmities, people being ostracized because they are widows or widowers, people being ostracized because they can't afford to pray in a certain way. Jesus' walk, Jesus' procession into Jerusalem is an eternal victory. It is a victory that has already been won. It has already been won because he has healed. He has listened. He has prayed. He has brought good news to the margins. And although all this has already happened, and although we know Easter will come, that does not leave us off the hook. So Palm Sunday sets the stage for us, knowing that only God can give us our salvation, that only God has the power to free us from the bonds and the chains of earthly and heavenly matters. But we start with Holy Week. We start with this procession, knowing that God has done all these things, that God will continue to do all these things. But as we look forward to Maundy Thursday and Good Friday, we are all too well aware that humans are going to be human. We are all too aware that we are human. And while God's salvation is miraculous and Jesus' teaching are life-changing, in a theology of liberation and in being a disciple of Jesus, there is action that is required. The need to promote and practice justice and love, not only at the personal level, in our personal family circles and friend groups, but also in societal practices and structures. This Palm Passion Sunday is the start of Holy Week. It is a necessity of this week. All that happens after is necessary to fully understand God's grace. That at the end of Good Friday and Holy Saturday, at the end of Easter Sunday, when the tomb is rolled away and Jesus is no longer there, despite the events of Good Friday, despite the denial of Peter, the betrayal of Judas, the silence of the disciples, and the shouts of those to release Barabbas, Easter still comes. Jesus enters into Jerusalem not as a conquering hero, but as someone whose purpose has been fulfilled, as someone who has clearly communicated his vision for the world. And how do we know that he has achieved this? Because what he says about the stones. There have been a few famous stones in history. You might think first of the sword and the stone, in which we've watched the Disney film 4 times this past week. Archimedes, if you've seen it, is my favorite character. Also one of the most relatable characters. And we can wonder, if you know the stories of Camelot, the mythology of how the sword got in the stone, you can wonder about how many people have tried to pull that sword out of that stone. And if you go to Disney World in the Magic Kingdom, there is a sword in the stone, and you can try and pull it out, but the secret is it's on a random timer. But there is a switch that a cast member can push it to help you pull it out. They don't often do it, but it is on a timer. So even if you're the strongest or the weakest, you never know whether you might be able to pull it out. And we can imagine, even in the Magic Kingdom, the amount of disappointment, the amount of sweat and tears, melted ice cream, melted popsicles, all the things that have fell down on that stone as people have tried to pull it out. When the Pharisees ask Jesus to tell his disciples to be quiet, he says, I could, but these stones would cry out. And we could wonder what those stones might say. Those stones that have been the entryway on the roads to Jerusalem for years. Because those roads and those stones don't fade as decrees from centurions fade, as emperors fade. They don't fade as writing from tax collectors or Pharisees do. Those stones have been there for a long time and will continue to have been there for a long time. Yet Jesus says, even if the people were to be quiet, those stones would shout out and rejoice. There's something eternal, there's something primordial there. That even if the people were silent, Jesus' entry into Jerusalem would cause these inanimate stones to shout with acclamation, with joy, and with praise. This wasn't a simple entry and procession into Jerusalem. This was arguably a world-changing event when even if the people were silent, the stones would cry out in witness at the gravity of what that man had done and would do in the coming days. One of the neat things about this procession, one of the neat things about Jesus, as there are many, is that you could imagine the sounds and sights that come with a parade. If you've seen the movie Troy, if you've seen the movie 300, any ancient military movie, you can hear the sounds of soldiers and generals walking through. You can hear the clank of armor, the spear tips dragging alongside the stone, the heavy thundering of the hooves of the war horses and of the chariots, the jingling of coin from the treasures that have been looted, the despairing cries of captives and foreign dignitaries that were paraded through. But on that day, on that Palm Sunday, all they had to hear was the awkward and uneven clop-clop of a colt's hooves, who probably did not have any horseshoes on either. So there's no thundering hooves of war, no jangle of coins, but the uneven, awkward sound of a colt's hooves going along the road, and the muffled sound of cloaks being tossed like this. Two very different sounds, two very different scenes. But only one represents the entry of a king. Only one represents true power and true salvation. On this day, we enter into Holy Week, not with thunderous applause, but we enter as Jesus did, perhaps a little silent, perhaps a little tentative, but confident in the task at hand. As you go through this Holy Week and as you prepare for Easter Sunday, try not to think about the resurrection just yet. Just because we know the story doesn't mean we have to start celebrating early. But try and allow yourself, if you have a Bible at home, starting around this reading from Luke chapter 19, try and do a little bit each day. Keep it in mind that when Jesus entered in, he entered with a victory already won. He entered as King, Prince of the world. And at the end of that story, at the end of the interactions of his friends and disciples, the tomb was still empty. On this day, may we celebrate the victory of Jesus that doesn't always come with fanfare, but does come with a promise of liberation and a guarantee of grace. Let us work with God as we are messengers and builders of the justice that Jesus spoke of and the justice that made Jesus king. Amen.